So I apologize for this plywood being in the frame of this shop, but I'm always working on multiple projects at once in here, and it just so happens that the projects I'm working on now are all quite large. So I've completely run out of space, and this is kind of the best I could do for the intro. But this is my current project that I'm going to be filming for YouTube. This is a very large liquor cabinet. Right now, it's basically built. The top still needs to be added, but the customer wants to see a couple options for that, which is why it's not on there. But this is pretty much ready for paint tomorrow. This is a little over 5 feet long. It's going to be 34 inches tall once it's all said and done. It's about 24 inches deep, so it's quite large, and it used up about 2 sheets of 3/4 inch ply, so it's also quite heavy. But it was a nice build because there was a lot going on and some challenges in it. So those are always fun for filming for YouTube. Obviously there's going to be drawer making, door making, wine storage. This cabinet has custom storage for wine glasses. That one's left open for liquor bottles as well as drawers. And the first part of this series is mainly going to be showing how I built the carcass. This is glued together and screwed from the top and the bottom because you won't see them. But these 3 wine panels in the center are still removable, and that is mainly because I think if I left them in there it would be too heavy to transport by myself to the customer shop, but also because it's going to be painted. If you've ever painted one of these, it is such a pain if it's like that. If I could take these out and paint them, it's going to be much easier. So like I said, this is going to be getting a coat of primer tomorrow. I believe this is going to be a 3-part series. So this piece is basically an oversized cabinet with a few bells and whistles, so that's how I approached building it. I'm going to start by rough cutting out my pieces. I kind of rough cut them in the shop, almost like a human panel saw, and then I could cut them down to size on the table saw. I started this a couple weeks ago, so it's still quite cold out. This piece is actually going to the exact same customer that got the built-in. When I was at their house for the initial measurement of the built-in, they asked for this to be built as well, so I was able to squeeze them into the schedule. The other nice thing about this was, if you watch the built-in series, you know that that was over 4 feet wide. Whenever that happens with sheet goods especially, or even 2x4s, you have to buy a lot of extra material because you lose a lot when stuff isn't 4 feet. When you can't get 2 pieces out of a 4-foot sheet, you can only get 1. So it was nice to be able to use all those extra cutoffs on another piece of furniture for them, because I don't piece out plywood. If I have to buy a sheet, the customer pays for a sheet of it. Once I had this rough cut the top and bottom, I could start laying out for the wine bottles. I gave a little bit of breather room for the wine bottles because not all of them are standard sizes. So you should be able to fit the smaller bottles in there. They didn't really seem to want space for larger size bottles, which worked out. It made the math a little bit easier, and I could cut dados. I made a dado jig a couple years ago. I really only use it about once a year, but when I do use it, it's an invaluable tool. I believe there is a video on my channel showing how I made this, but wide dado grooves are not extremely accurate on my table saw because I just don't have the space to cut them. And you can cut them on the radial arm saw, but this panel's over 24 inches wide, so I wouldn't be able to cut them in one pass on the radial arm, so I'd have to flip them, and you lose accuracy doing that. So I just used the dado jig, and I could go through. The nice thing about this jig is it does give you pretty perfect width dimensions because you're using your stock to set up the width dimensions. You could see it leaves a little piece. You could cut that piece out with the router. I just find it easier to remove with a chisel. And then I have just a scrap piece there to make sure that it's a nice fit. These are pretty shallow dados. They don't have to be super thick. I just use dados are great for alignment as well as structure. And then I could keep moving down the piece. I believe there were 5 of these to cut for the top and the bottom. And then once again checking the fit. Sometimes towards the edge it was a little bit shallow, and I just chiseled it out, but it worked out really well. Once I had the top, I just transferred those marks to the bottom piece, and I cut them so that they would work out to be perfectly square. You can see I'm just transferring them, and then that's what the bottom looked like. So then I could go through and start cutting the two sides. The two sides I rabbeted in place, so they're a little bit different dimension than all the center panels, but that's basically what this is. I'm cutting the center panels for the wine storage and the two sides with a bunch of this scrap. You could see how much plywood's going into this piece and why it weighs so much. I believe a 3/4 inch piece of veneered ply is about 60 pounds. So with multiples in there as well as hardware and everything, this piece is pretty heavy. And it has a 1/2 inch backer as well. So then this is just cutting the rabbet for the top. You could see how I measured the depth for the fence by using a scrap piece of ply, and I could go through and rabbet these together. I use rabbets and dados to build pretty much all my cabinets. It takes a little bit more time, but I find it's more structurally sound, less likely to come apart over time, less likely to rack, and much easier for glue-ups because the pieces pretty much align themselves. So I put a rabbet on the top and the bottom. The sides of this are going to be seen, but the top and the bottoms won't, so I could use hardware to temporarily attach this, but I also did it permanently just so that I don't have to use clamps for glue-up because, like I said, keep saying this piece is quite large, so I didn't have clamps big enough. But you can see I just used 2 little screws in the corners of the top and the bottom to temporarily hold this carcass together. So then once I had it on my table, I used the level before I cut these center partitions because that top is so long it's gonna bow. If you don't use a level and you measure the height, it's pretty much guaranteed they're gonna be too short. Then you'll have a bow at the top of your piece. So by putting that level on there, it makes that top flat. You can get an accurate measurement. So like I said, I went through and cut all these pieces roughly out. I knew these were going to slide into place, so I chamfered the bottom and the tops. Just makes fitting it a little bit easier. But I started with my 2 edges, and then I could cut the other 3 and fit them all into place. So sometimes I cut the rabbet for the backer before I put everything together. With this I didn't, so I just used a rabbeting bit on my router to go through. This is the back side at this point, and cut a shallow groove, and that will be the backer. I'm using 1/2 inch plywood for the backer, mainly because this cabinet is so big, it will add structure to it, but also because, like I said, this piece was the same piece that's going into the family that bought the built-in. And I happen to have multiple scrap sheets of 1/2 inch backer because I couldn't get 2 sheets out of the 4-foot panel because, like I said, the built-in was over 4 feet. So I had this around. This is also detachable because I think carrying it and strapping it to the roof of my car will be much easier without the backer in place. I usually make them detachable anyways, but this is just cutting those pieces. So you can see there is the rabbet, and then the great thing about adding a backer is not only does it add structure, if you don't have it in there, your piece kind of acts like a parallelogram. You can see when I'm adding it how much it shifts, and the backer will just shear everything up and square it as well. So you can see I have to shift the whole piece to even get it in place, but then once that backer's in place, it can't move. So I cut these so that they meet in the center partition so that the seam is hidden. And then that is what that looks like with the backer in place. And I'll temporarily attach this with a couple screws as well. So at this point with the backer, and this is quite heavy, it's not necessarily the weight that's the problem, it's because it is so tall and so wide, it's hard for myself at least to wrap my hands around the whole piece and get a good grip. That's kind of where the challenge was coming in with moving this around the shop. So now that I have it in place on the table, it's not going to move until it goes to the customer's house. So you can see I'm taking those center pieces off to make it a little bit easier. I could get inside the cabinet and be able to lift it up. So now this is also getting about a 4.5 inch drawer on top, and I'm going to dado this in place as well. Since this is such a large cabinet, I wanted as much glue as possible to kind of hold this together. So you can see that the edges are a little bit different than the height of the center pieces. So I didn't want to measure that way. I wanted to measure from the inside of the cabinet so they're all in the same spot. So all I did was measure from the inside of the cabinet so they're coming down the exact same amount from the top of that piece of plywood. And then I could just detach one piece at a time, cut that dado, and put it back into place so I don't have to disassemble the whole carcass. So you could see from the top down that's a different measurement on the end panel than it would be from the middle panel, which is why I measured from the inside of the cabinet. And even though I was pretty adamant about doing this, you'll see later in the video this measurement between the two edges was off by a little bit, and these are inset doors, so I'll show you how I handled that when it came time to make those. The cabinet carcass itself glued up square, it was just those two panels were off slightly. So once I had those dados cut, I could go through and start calculating for the wine storage. I once again made these a little oversized for different size bottles, but it's basically 3.5 inch squares. And you can see I'm going to be shallow dadoing some strips of poplar into here to hold up these pieces. Starting from the bottom, I worked my way 3.5 inches up. It just so happened the math worked out just about perfectly for these. Otherwise you'll have some uneven spaces, but I was pretty lucky. I pre-planned it a little bit, but the dimension size were what the customer wanted, and it just happened to work out. So you can see with these shallow dados, the poplar I cut was, I believe, 3/4 inches by about 1 inch. So once I have this set up, I can go through and cut every single dado for all of the pieces so that they're identical. You definitely do not want them to not be identical. If you're going to be storing wine, you don't want it uneven or anything. Not only will it not look good, but it's not as structural. So then I could just work my way down the piece. Now these don't have to be super accurate, so if they're off 1/16th of an inch or so, it's not that big of a deal. The important part is that they're all the same. So you can see I could set the fence and cut every single one. And the middle partition has one on either side. So these turned out being perfect. And then that's what the final piece looks like. And like I said, these three middle panels are removable for ease of painting and also for weight, keeping it lighter to transport. And then once on site, I could add some screws to the top and bottom, and they'll be permanently attached. So I was using a scrap piece of poplar for the initial measurements, but this is the poplar I'm using for the pieces. And like I said, poplar that I get at the store is 3/4 of an inch, and these were about 7/8 of an inch to an inch, and that was basically based off of what I had in stock. Once again, I used a lot of poplar to make the 8 doors for the customer on the built-in, and I had all these little scrap pieces, so it worked out perfectly. I had just enough for that piece. These little inch scrap pieces of poplar I don't have a ton of use for other than scrap projects, so it worked out nicely, and I could just slide these all into place. These will all be glued and braided into place permanently, but with the dados you could see how nice it is to mock up things. It kind of holds itself in place. And then this is going to be the shelf partition for the top and bottom. So that was pretty easy. I just measured and then cut those. And that's the rough carcass. So then I didn't glue this together at the point I had it made. This is probably a week or so later, but just for consistency of the video, it made sense to show the glue up. So you can see I'm just gluing these 2 edge pieces, which will help square up this whole thing. I also need these permanently attached to make the doors and the drawers, but the 3 center pieces I'm leaving out. And I could screw these in from the top and the bottom because, like I keep saying, you won't see those. And I could even patch the holes before I paint, and then it doesn't really matter. You won't see them at all. So I have those in place, and then I could go through and add the edges as well as the shelves to delineate between the shelving and where the doors are going to be. I ran out of ply, so one of them is 2 sheets. You could see that here, but like I said, these are going to just be pretty much hidden because there's going to be a drawer up top, so it won't matter that there's a little seam. And then I could add the sides, could square everything up, add those screws into the bottom, and then this is the main carcass. I also add the backer at this point because, like I said, the backer helps square everything up. These cabinets will act like a parallelogram till you add that backer.